They called him Crazy Eddie, the man under the Riverside Bridge who talked to pigeons and counted passing cars in sets of 7. The same man police officers shoved along twice a week, telling him to move it along. This isn't a campsite. The same man commuters stepped around on their way to important jobs, their eyes carefully avoiding his weathered face and cardboard sign that simply read veteran. Anything helps. What none of them knew, what not even the social workers who occasionally brought him sandwiches understood, was that the homeless man they dismissed as mentally unstable once held the blueprints to their entire city in his hands. And when disaster struck at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, those same hands that rattled a coffee can for spare change would guide thousands to safety using knowledge he wasn't supposed to remember. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you appreciate stories about unsung heroes who hide in plain sight, consider subscribing to support more content like this. The underpass reeked of urine and exhaust fumes, but Eddie Morrison had called it home for 3 years. His bedroom consisted of flattened cardboard boxes arranged with military precision, a sleeping bag that had seen better decades, and a plastic milk crate containing everything he owned. Most people assumed the 58-year-old veteran was just another casualty of the system, another broken soldier who couldn't adjust to civilian life. They saw the graying beard, the clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks, the way he sometimes stared into space for minutes at a time, and they made their judgments. What they didn't see was the way Eddie's eyes tracked every structural detail of the bridge above him, how he mentally cataloged the stress points in the concrete, the drainage patterns when it rained, the precise angle of the support beams. They didn't notice that his seemingly random wanderings through the city followed the exact same routes he'd surveyed 15 years earlier as Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the man who designed the emergency evacuation protocols for the entire metropolitan area. Officer Patricia Valdez made her usual rounds that Tuesday morning, her patrol car slowing as she spotted Eddie arranging small stones in neat rows beside his makeshift shelter. "Morrison, you can't be doing weird rituals down here. People are complaining." Eddie looked up from his stones, his blue eyes clearer than most people expected. "Just organizing, officer. Helps me think." "Think about what?" "How to panhandle more effectively." Valdez's tone carried the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. Eddie's arrangement wasn't random. Each stone represented a major intersection in the city's grid system, positioned according to traffic flow patterns he'd memorized years ago. But he simply nodded. Something like that. Dr. Sarah Chun from the downtown mission had tried reaching Eddie for months. The soft-spoken psychiatrist saw something in his case file that others missed. A redacted military record that went far beyond the standard infantry service most assumed. "Eddie, I found a bed at the transitional housing facility. Clean room, 3 meals a day, job placement assistance." Eddie shook his head, the same response he'd given a dozen times. "I'm needed here." "Needed for what?" "You're sleeping under a bridge, collecting bottles. This isn't serving anyone." But Eddie's gaze was already shifting to the morning rush hour traffic above, his internal clock tracking patterns that would matter more than anyone realized in just a few hours. Sometimes being in the right place matters more than being in the right bed. The Jackson Marketing Building rose 47 stories into the downtown sky, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Inside, 3,400 employees began their Tuesday routines, unaware that the building's foundation sat on the precise geological fault line that Eddie had flagged in his original city planning report as structurally vulnerable during seismic events exceeding 4.5 magnitude. At 3:47 p.m., the earthquake hit. It started as a low rumble that most people mistook for a passing truck convoy. But Eddie, arranging his evening meal of donated bread beside the Riverside Bridge, felt it immediately. Not just the shaking, the specific frequency that matched his calculations from 15 years ago. His trained mind processed what others couldn't. This wasn't just any earthquake. This was the exact scenario he'd war-gamed in his emergency planning sessions, the one that would turn downtown into a death trap if people followed their instincts instead of optimal evacuation routes. The Jackson building swayed ominously as office workers streamed toward the stairwells in panic. But Eddie knew something they didn't. The eastern stairwell would collapse at the 14th floor. The western route would hold, but only if traffic flow was regulated. Without thinking, without hesitation, the homeless man everyone ignored began running toward the city center. His first stop was the intersection of 5th and Main, where panicked drivers were already creating gridlock that would prevent emergency vehicles from reaching the disaster zone. Eddie stepped into traffic, his unwashed clothes and wild hair making him look like any other street person having a breakdown. But his movements were precise, purposeful. "Left lane only," he shouted at confused drivers, directing them with hand signals that seemed random but followed traffic management protocols most police didn't know. Emergency vehicles coming through. A businessman in a BMW rolled down his window. "Get out of the road, you crazy homeless freak." Eddie ignored the insult. His attention focused on the bigger picture. He could see the emergency response patterns forming exactly as he designed them, if people followed the right routes. The earthquake had stopped, but the real disaster was just beginning as thousands of frightened people made choices that would determine who lived and who died. At the Jackson building, Fire Chief Martinez was coordinating the evacuation when he noticed something odd. A homeless man had somehow gotten past the security perimeter and was standing at the base of the building, apparently talking to evacuees as they emerged. "Sir, you need to get back behind the line," Martinez called out. But as he got closer, he realized the homeless man wasn't just talking. He was directing people with incredible precision. 14th floor and above, take the west stairwell only. Ground to 13th, east stairwell is faster. Move in groups of 6. Count your steps, don't run. Martinez frowned. Those weren't standard evacuation procedures, but somehow the flow of people was more organized than any disaster drill he'd ever seen. "How do you know about building evacuations?" Eddie's response was matter-of-fact. "I designed the protocols." Before Martinez could process that statement, his radio crackled with reports of a gas leak 6 blocks north. Standard procedure would be to evacuate in a circular pattern, but Eddie grabbed the chief's arm. "Not circular. Northeast only. The wind patterns will carry the gas southwest. Evacuate against the geological grain, not with it." Martinez stared at this homeless man, who was suddenly speaking like a disaster management expert. "Who the hell are you?" But Eddie was already moving, his mental map of the city guiding him toward the next crisis point. At the Riverside Hospital, he found chaos as staff tried to evacuate critical patients while maintaining life support systems. Eddie approached the overwhelmed administrator. "The backup generators are on the 3rd floor. When the aftershock hits, in approximately 18 minutes, that floor will flood from the broken water main in the adjacent building. You need to move the generators to the roof now." The administrator looked at Eddie's disheveled appearance and nearly dismissed him. But something in the man's eyes, the certainty in his voice, made her hesitate. "How could you possibly know when an aftershock will hit?" "Because I've been monitoring the seismic patterns for 3 years. Every tremor, every stress point. I know this city's geological structure better than anyone alive." She made the call. 30 minutes later, when the aftershock struck exactly as Eddie predicted and the 3rd floor flooded, the hospital's backup power remained stable, keeping dozens of patients alive. Word began spreading through the emergency response network about the homeless man who seemed to know everything. Police officers found him directing traffic with uncanny precision. Firefighters discovered he knew the exact water pressure requirements for each district. Paramedics realized he was somehow anticipating where the injuries would be worst. Detective Ray Costello had been searching for Eddie for 2 hours, following reports of a crazy homeless guy who was somehow coordinating disaster response better than the official teams. He found him at the collapsed overpass on Highway 52, where Eddie was examining the rubble with the focused intensity of an engineer. "Sir, I need to ask you some questions. People are saying you've been giving emergency instructions that are..." Costello paused, choosing his words carefully. "Unusually accurate." Eddie looked up from the concrete debris, his analysis complete. 3 people trapped under the northeast section. They have approximately 40 minutes of air. Standard rescue approach will destabilize the remaining structure. You need to cut through the drainage tunnel underneath." Costello felt a chill of recognition. "How do you know about drainage tunnels?" Because I designed them. The detective's training kicked in. He pulled out his phone and started recording. State your full name for the record. Edward Morrison, Lieutenant Colonel, retired. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Project designation, Metropolitan Emergency Infrastructure Planning, classified level Charlie 7. Costello's face went pale. He'd heard that designation before, in briefings about the city's disaster preparedness systems. You're telling me you're the Eddie Morrison? The one who designed our emergency protocols? Was. Now I'm just Eddie who lives under a bridge and knows where the weak points are. The rescue operation at the overpass proceeded exactly as Eddie had predicted. The 3 trapped victims were extracted through the drainage tunnel with minutes to spare. But for Eddie, it was just one more confirmation that his knowledge, his 15 years of detailed city planning, remained as sharp as ever despite what people assumed about his mental state. As the sun set on the disaster, the unofficial casualty count was remarkably low. What should have been a catastrophic event with hundreds of deaths had resulted in only minor injuries. Emergency response teams were calling it a miracle, but they were beginning to understand the real reason. Fire Chief Martinez found Eddie sitting on the steps of City Hall, finally allowing himself a moment of rest. I need to understand something. If you designed all our emergency systems, if you know the city this well, why are you living under a bridge? Eddie's answer revealed the tragedy behind the expertise. PTSD doesn't care about your engineering degree, Chief. Depression doesn't care about your security clearance. I designed systems to save thousands of lives, but I couldn't design a system to save my own career when the nightmares got too bad. He gestured toward the city, where lights were beginning to come back on in buildings that should have collapsed. 3 tours in Iraq, building infrastructure under fire. Came home and couldn't sleep without checking every structural detail 3 times. Couldn't hold a job because I kept seeing failure points in everything: bridges, buildings, relationships. Martinez sat down beside him, the weight of realization settling in. So you've been watching our city all this time? Monitoring it? Someone had to. I wrote the emergency protocols, but I also know they're only as good as the people implementing them. Politicians cut corners. Contractors use cheap materials. Maintenance gets deferred. I've been tracking every deviation from the original specs for 3 years. The conversation was interrupted by Detective Costello, who approached with a tablet in his hands. Colonel Morrison, I've been reviewing your military file. The parts that aren't classified anyway. You designed emergency systems for 12 major cities, consulted on disaster preparedness for NATO, wrote the textbook on urban survival strategies. Eddie nodded. And then I designed myself right into a corner. Turns out knowing how everything can go wrong makes it hard to function when everything seems wrong. Dr. Chen arrived, having been called to the scene by the police. She'd spent months trying to help Eddie, never knowing the full scope of his background. Eddie, I had no idea about your qualifications. The military records just showed standard service. Classified designation. Even my discharge papers are redacted. Easier to be seen as just another broken veteran than to explain why a decorated engineer is collecting bottles for rent money. The 3 officials exchanged glances, each processing the implications. The homeless man they'd variously ignored moved along, and tried to help was actually one of the most qualified disaster management experts in the country. Why didn't you tell anyone? Dr. Chen asked. We could have found you work, housing, proper support. Eddie's laugh was bitter, but not unkind. Who's going to hire a homeless engineer with PTSD? Who's going to trust emergency planning to someone who can't keep his own life together? I tried that route. Job interviews, where they see the gap in employment and assume addiction or instability. He stood up, brushing dust from his worn jacket. Besides, I was exactly where I needed to be today. Under that bridge, I could monitor seismic activity better than any office building. Living on the streets, I knew traffic patterns, population flows, infrastructure vulnerabilities. Sometimes the best observation post is the one nobody notices. As the night wore on, more details emerged about Eddie's unofficial disaster response. Security cameras showed him at 17 different critical locations throughout the afternoon, each time providing instructions that prevented what could have been catastrophic failures. Traffic management that saved hours of gridlock. Building evacuations that prevented stampedes. Infrastructure assessments that guided emergency resource allocation. Mayor Patricia Williams arrived at City Hall near midnight, having been briefed on the day's events. She found Eddie still sitting on the steps, now surrounded by emergency response officials who were treating him with something approaching reverence. "Colonel Morrison, I want to personally thank you for what you did today. The preliminary estimates suggest your actions saved hundreds of lives." Eddie accepted the gratitude with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all day. "Just doing my job, ma'am, even if it's not officially my job anymore." "I'd like to change that. Our emergency management director position has been vacant for 6 months. Full benefits, housing allowance, access to mental health services. We need someone with your expertise." The offer hung in the air, but Eddie's response surprised everyone. "I appreciate that, Mayor, but I'm not sure I'm ready for an office again. The city survived today because I was watching it from the outside. Sometimes the most important work happens in the margins." Detective Costello had been quietly reviewing reports on his tablet. "Colonel, there's something else. The earthquake prediction, the precise timing. Our geological survey team says that level of accuracy should be impossible without advanced equipment." Eddie smiled for the first time that day. Homeless people notice things others don't. When you're sleeping on the ground every night, you feel every vibration. When you have nothing but time, you start seeing patterns. 3 years of watching this city, feeling its rhythms, tracking its stress points. You learn to read it like a book. Dr. Chen finally understood the full scope of what she'd been witnessing in her sessions with Eddie. "The organizational behaviors I noted, the way you arrange objects in precise patterns, you've been modeling the city's infrastructure. Helps me think through scenarios. Every rock represents a building, every stick is a street. When you can't afford computer modeling software, you get creative." As dawn broke over the city, the full extent of Eddie's unofficial guardian role became clear. For 3 years, the man everyone dismissed as Crazy Eddie had been conducting the most comprehensive infrastructure monitoring project in the city's history, all from under a bridge, using his training, his knowledge, and his unique position outside the system that had failed him. Fire Chief Martinez made the decision that would change everything. "Colonel, I don't care if you want the official job or not. As far as I'm concerned, you're our consulting expert. We'll set up a communication system, get you proper monitoring equipment. You keep watching the city from wherever you want to watch it from." Eddie considered this, his engineer's mind already working through the possibilities. "I'd need access to seismic data, structural reports, maintenance schedules." "Done. And I stay where I am. The bridge gives me the best central observation point. We'll make sure you have whatever support you need there." For the first time in 3 years, Eddie Morrison allowed himself to hope that his knowledge might be valued rather than dismissed, that his service might continue in a way that honored both his capabilities and his limitations. The story spread through social media and local news, but Eddie insisted on anonymity. He remained under the Riverside Bridge, but now his cardboard shelter was supplemented with weather monitoring equipment and communication devices. The man people had called Crazy Eddie became the unofficial guardian angel of the city's infrastructure, proving that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform or work from an office. Sometimes it sits under a bridge, counting cars in sets of 7, and watching over 800,000 people who never knew they needed watching over. Sometimes the most important person in the city is the one everyone assumes doesn't matter. And sometimes, when disaster strikes, the homeless veteran who talks to pigeons turns out to be exactly the person everyone needed him to be all along. If this story touched you, and you found something meaningful in it, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to support more stories like this.